Thank you so much, Andrew and Nick and Christina, for making today possible. It has been a really wonderful day, and I have been made to feel as an expert, and it's really always appreciated. So thank you so much for having me. My talk today is called Whiteness and Arthuriana in the Global North Atlantic, and I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Good. Okay. So first, I want to start with a quote from Leslie Mamasilko, a Laguna Pueblo native, and she has been instrumental in the way that I look and analyze Arthurian texts. So I want to start with her words, and she says, "I want to hear and to experience English in a non-traditional structure, a structure that follows patterns from the oral tradition. The structure of Pueblo expression resembles something like a spider's web, with many little threads radiating from a center, crisscrossing each other. As with the web, the structure will emerge as it is made, and you must simply listen and trust, as the Pueblo people do, that meaning will be made," end quote. And this idea actually has been completely instrumental in my work since I was a graduate student. And back then, I actually hid this in a footnote because I didn't feel I was allowed to say this. I wasn't allowed to say that my work was being crafted because of a Laguna Pueblo native. And it's really exciting that I can say it now. And I think it does show a change. And so please keep this quote in mind because it does contribute very much to what I will be saying. So here I go. Written by Joanot Martorell and finished posthumously by Martí Joan de Galva. Tirant Leblanc's for dedication explains that Martorell is translating from English to Portuguese and from Portuguese to Valencian vernacular. Valencian vernacular is a dialect of Catalan. But before delving into the chivalric adventures of Tirant, the text recounts the adventures of William of Warwick. By combining materials from Martorell's own text called William of Warwick and from the 13th century Romance Guy of Warwick, an Anglo-Norman text translated to English, Irish, and French. In the 13th century Guy of Warwick, the titular knight fights against the Danes, but both of Martorell's versions describe an English knight that fights against and expels Muslims living in England. Martorell's Warwick uses materials from Ramon Lull's Libro del Orde de Caballería as part of the Romance. Lull is a second-generation Catalan born in colonial Majorca, an island that was captured by the Catalans, who killed and enslaved the Muslim population of the island. Therefore, before we even get to Tirant, the text has moved the reader from England to Portugal to Valencia through its supposed translation history. It then introduces us to Warwick, moving us from England into a crusader fantasy that relies on Catalan Majorcan chivalry. Therefore, Martorell begins with a violent chivalric fantasy that argues for the expulsion of Muslims and then starts in the Atlantic and moves us southward to the Mediterranean, the global North Atlantic. I will come back to Majorca, but what I want to get across is that Tirant exemplifies how chivalric Arthurian texts were exclusionary and normalized violence. Tirant is also an example of why I rely on theoretical terminology that describes how Arthurian texts function within the cultural and genre systems that shape them. From the beginning of my research on Arthurian texts, I was interested in understanding how the cultural and geospatial peripheries of medieval Europe transformed the text. I came to the realization that comparative research on medieval Arthuriana tends to center on what the field calls first-tier texts, written in English, French, and German. First-tier Arthurian texts include the works of recognized writers such as Geoffrey of Monmouth, Chrétien de Troyes and Godfrey von Strasbourg, for example. The result of the situation is that second-tier Arthurian texts, which include anonymous translations of first-tier texts, pseudo-translations and rewritings, as well as innovative stories, are rarely given substantial comparative readings with each other. My project began by asking what happens if we study peripheral Arthurian texts without placing the supposed canon as the center. I began to focus on medieval Arthurian texts that are generally considered second tier and that are written in Castilian, Catalan, Old Norse Icelandic, and Welsh. I started my study of Arthurian literature by following Leslie Mamon's Silko metaphor of a web, with the premise that the dissemination of Arthurian text was not linear, but rather like a web spreading out circular and cyclical within the political, historical, and commercial interconnections of Europe. But what I quickly realized is that I am looking at interconnections between and among Christianity, Europe, North Africa, and the Islamic world. I realized that to concentrate principally on finding an original, common, or universal Arthurian tale is fundamentally to misunderstand the complex phenomenon of Arthur, and practically speaking, to exclude many of the most interesting variations. Instead, re-examining Arthuriana through an emphasis on physical, literary, and linguistic border crossings highlights that the current notions of the transmission of Arthurian texts are missing the whole picture. Arthurian narratives were not simply disseminated from Britain via France to the rest of Europe, as is the common assumption, but were instead produced and read across a pan-European network. Corpus was not produced through a unilateral transfer of narratives from a source to a target culture. Instead, a reciprocal relationship was formed between a variety of sources and a variety of targets. In essence, we must remap our conception of the movement of medieval Arthuriana through an understanding of interconnections between medieval European cultures. And so this is a map I constantly use. It's a map from an exhibition that happened at the Library of Spain on Amadís de Gaula in 2008. And the idea is that it's trying to show sort of the transmission of Arthuriana is sort of like the way that we sort of imagine it now, right? And I like to show this map because then what I want to show you is this is the way that I envision the movement of medieval Arthuriana. This is the mapping that I see when I look at the text in the peripheries and look at how they work with each other. And so what's important about this, that this is where my understanding of Arthuriana begins. This is not the ending of my trajectory, but it's the beginning of the trajectory. We understand that these texts are moving in multiple ways and directions simultaneously, then what is it that they're doing? Because we need a methodology that considers the interconnections between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean world. I call for a reassessment of the North Atlantic, what I call the global North Atlantic. I want to demonstrate the important links between and among Arthurian literature, which is often understood as British, with the Iberian Peninsula and the north of Africa. I want to demonstrate that the peninsula and the north of Africa must be included in studies of the medieval North Atlantic, which is often defined as the British Isles, the English Channel, Iceland, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. One example in particular highlights the ways that I aim to rethink the cultural connections between cultures in the global North Atlantic. A shared aspect of the Icelandic saga of Tristan and Isolde from the 14th century, and the Castilian Crónica de Tristán de Leonís y del rey Don Tristás de Leoní el joven su hijo from 1534, is that Tristan, generally considered a British hero in other traditions, is Spanish, in fact, king of Spain. He fights both Africans and Muslims and drives them out of Spain, connecting the Arthurian legends to the Crusades. Iceland is responsible for the introduction of a Spanish Tristan that fights Africans and Muslims, showing that the writer was aware of Spain as a geographical location and as an ideological space. These texts create foreign aggressors that are made different by racial markers that include physical, geographical, and religious differences, and they participate in a larger discourse designed to justify crusading Africa, the East, and the Iberian Peninsula. Scholarship of the North Atlantic and on Arthurian literature has downplayed these connections, which, as I will argue, are tied to the self-construction of whiteness. The theoretical framework of the global North Atlantic helps me to localize Arthuriana as a system with interrelated threads, which I analyze through two different but interconnected practices. First, I pay careful attention to the dissemination of Arthurian texts throughout Europe, depicting the non-linear circulation of the materials and how they shape and are shaped by the political, historical, and commercial interconnections between Africa, Europe, and the Islamic world. Second, I focus on the themes and ideas that circulated within these texts, finding that they tend to support Christian chivalric ideologies. These texts are part of a system that is constructing a medieval European self by erasing European diversity, dehumanizing Muslims and other racial and religious groups, and normalizing these violent ideologies. Moreover, Arthurian texts at the European periphery, Iceland and Wales, for example, use ideologies of expansion to resist subordination by including themselves in a chivalric enterprise and expressing a willingness to participate in the eradication of religious and racial diversity. Peripheral Arthurian texts reject ideologies of expansion when it relates to their own medieval colonization, but they uphold these ideological systems when they promote expansion within and beyond the borders of an imagined medieval Europe. When I think of the Arthurian corpus as a system, I see movement and colonization, a litmus test for whiteness. I localize whiteness by analyzing what the texts normalize. What do they assume as the norm? Arthurian texts racialize the enemies of the titular characters by dehumanizing them and normalizing violence in several ways, depending on the context and place of creation. And this is one of the things that white supremacy does. It normalizes exclusionary violence based on race. In Arthurian texts, exclusionary violence is tied to the creation of the medieval national borders of what we call Europe. Because race is a social fabrication, it is also an unstable signifier that means different things, not just to different cultures and peoples, but also to people of different races within the same culture. Therefore, the language and systems that create racial demarcations change constantly. And just like race is not a fixed ideology, the creation of medieval European borders is not fixed either. Even as the medieval kingdoms of Europe were trying to territorialize themselves, the borders were in constant flux, changing through battles, contracts, and marriages. Arthurian texts use fantasy to redefine the borders of Europe in favor of local political needs within medieval European nations, because the borders of the Arthurian realm were created to promulgate Christian expansion and rationalize religious and racial exclusion. Medieval Arthuriana used chivalry to imagine the borders of Europe, to shift, change, and expand real borders. They helped further advance medieval nationalisms, conquest and crusade, and medieval colonization. The very fluidity of these signifiers, race, medieval border formation, chivalry, and even fantasy, made possible their conglomeration in medieval Arthuriana. Medieval Romance advocates for expansion by imagining the European margins in peril, often presenting this peril in the forms of enemies, then claiming the lands of those opponents. The margins become central to the depiction of an idealized medieval European chivalric and national system. In this way, Christian European courts use Arthuriana to test for whiteness, to present themselves as a racialized Christian European whole, with the intent of imagining the expansion of the borders of Europe for self-gain and stature. These different European courts transformed the material to fit their own ideologies of expansion through the phenomenon of exclusion and dehumanization, which is apparent throughout most of Arthurian medieval romance. I understand that I begin by making rather large claims and introducing a new geographical and ideological network of study, the global North Atlantic. I am describing Arthurian text as a toxic genre that is used throughout Europe to begin constructing whiteness. I am aware that my readings pushes against previous approaches to Arthurian studies, although not all. However, I do not make these claims lightly. I make them through the study of a robust Arthurian corpus that includes the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, with careful attention to Ivan and Erec and Enid, the Welsh Culhwch and Olwen, the Imperator, both available in the collection The Mabinogion, the Norwegian Tristan Saga of Gisandar, and its pseudo translation, the Icelandic Saga of Tristan and Isolde. One is 13th century, the other 14th century. And it's in the Old Norse Icelandic sagas, Ivan Saga, Motus Saga, the Castilian Libro del Caballero Cifar, the Catalan Pom la Fala, the extant versions of Crónica de Don Tristán de Leonís, which we have versions from the 1400s, 1501 and 1534, the Catalan romances Curial y Guelfa and Tirán lo Blanc, and to a lesser extent, Miguel de Cervantes, El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha, to name the texts I most prioritize. I read these texts by putting them into conversation with each other as part of an Arthurian system, but also by putting them into conversation with other localized texts and their historiographies, and by relying on the excellent work done by scholars within their national languages and silos. As an example, my reading of the Catalan Arthurian corpus concentrates on La Faula, Curial y Guelfa, and Tirán lo Blanc, and relies on analyzing other Arthurian texts such as the Occitan Pom Jafre, as well as important Catalan texts such as the Crónico Libro del Fe de Rey Jaume. And because the Arthurian archive is so expansive, I do not work on the anonymous 14th century blending de Cornada, to name but one example. And my analysis would not be possible without the archival and editing work of scholars of Catalan, such as Ana María Campana Perrone Campano, who writes in Catalan, Vicente Ledo Guillem, who writes in English, and Stefano Maria Singolani, who writes in Catalan and Spanish, to name a few. Finally, I analyze these materials through a global perspective that benefits from the work of scholars such as Geraldine Heng, Sharon Kinoshita, and David Wax. This Catalan example also helps to understand my definition of Arthuriana. Curial y Guelfa and Tirán lo Blanc are not knights of the Round Table, nor do they fight alongside Arthur, for example. The main characters of these texts, however, are favorably compared to Arthurian knights, and the texts are clearly influenced by Arthurian romance. National and comparative Arthurian scholarship considers these texts Arthurian and include them in the many expansive collections on Arthuriana. My point is that my selection of texts does not go against the work done by previous scholars of Arthurian literature. My definition of Arthuriana, however, is influenced by the concept of family resemblances, which both distinguishes and unites the materials in the Arthurian web. The idea of family resemblances emerges in the work of philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. In philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein rejects the idea that certain concepts can be defined through one common set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Instead, he describes such concepts as a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing. He concludes, I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances, or the various resemblances between members of a family. Build, feature, color of eyes, gait, temperament, and so on and so forth, overlap and crisscross in the same way. My research is inspired by Wittgenstein's view of the philosophy of language, which I use as a foundation for moving away from the scholarly comparative Arthurian tradition that concentrates on searching for an original or a cohesive tale. I propose instead that there are family resemblances among the stories of various cultures and times. Different Arthurian texts are connected by their family resemblances, united as part of an Arthurian corpus, but also unique in their own right. It redefined the material, decontextualized the original text, and affirmed the specific ideologies of the writers and possibly their patrons. Arthurian texts are entrenched in the cultural systems that gave birth to a family of texts. In their totality, they are the many faces of Arthur. Now that I have defined my corpus and my findings, I would like to remind you that Arthurian literature spread throughout Europe as a manifestation of a pervasive social movement. It was conditioned by the logic of local needs. The ideology of the larger-than-life Arthurian knight from the text began to merge with the actual monarchy. Real knights and kings read and emulated Arthurian literature. In particular, Arthur and his knights must be understood to be part of a Christian, chivalric European system that expanded by encroaching on peripheral societies. These systems in their totality created a long-lasting conflict with the Islamic worlds through the Crusades, with the cultures thriving in Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula, and with both Christian and non-Christian cultures within Europe itself, including conflict between and among Scotland and Wales with the early English and the Anglo-Normans. In this context, Arthurian texts belong to the local cultural systems in which they were produced, as well as to a pan-European system that exchanged tangible, intellectual, and literary commodities. I analyzed global North Atlantic texts by paying close attention to their functions through interrelated theoretical models, as I've shown, global translation and critical race studies. I place Arthuriana alongside other forms of text, both literary and historical, as political tools that are part of a larger systems of propaganda that play a critical role in shaping the medieval national ambitions of their target cultures through ideologies of exclusion and border formation. The translation and codification of both written and oral Arthuriana becomes a form of political commentary that functions as liminal space both locally and globally. Arthuriana helps construct the margins of Europe by creating literary borders that define where Europe ended and the rest of their known world began. These borders were constantly shifting to accommodate and expel different groups of people. In this sense, Europe is what the texts argue belong within the borders. I use the term Europe instead of Latin Western Christendom, mainly because to use the term Western Latin Christendom to delineate the borders is to delineate the multicultural and multi-religious realities of medieval Europe. Arthurian texts reflect the social political interactions that cultural interconnections create. Global North Atlantic Arthurian texts become central in the political and historical struggles within the communities that produce them. The treatment of Arthur in Castilian, Catalan, Old North Icelandic, and Welsh, among other languages, suggests that Arthurian texts, for the most part, advocate for imperial expansion by imagining the European margins in peril, often presenting it in the forms of fantastical, aggressive opponents, and then claiming the lands of these opponents. In this way, the margins become central to the depiction of an idealized white European chivalric system. These texts reproduce, manipulate, and criticize the power structures of the courts in which they were circulated, and they imitate hierarchies of power within a Christian European stratum. In other words, these texts are using the Arthurian milieu to create fantasies and imagine a pan-European geography of exclusion. As Geraldine Heng writes, cultural fantasy does not evade but confronts history. Fantasy engages with lived events, crisis and trauma, and conditions of exigency in ways that render intelligible to humans the incalculable and the incommensurate. In particular, fantasy is unusually conducive to conceptualizations of race and race discourse. Race itself, after all, is a fantasy with fully material effects and consequences, end quote. Fantasy has an intimate connection with the reader or listener who most accept the fantasy world, the vacillation between the real and the imagined. These aspects of fantasy help the reader and listener suspend their disbelief and allow themselves to be engulfed by the fantasy story. Global North Atlantic Arthurian texts tend to racialize the enemies of the titular characters, to excuse medieval colonization, and thus allow the reader and listeners to engulf by the fantasy of whiteness and white supremacy. And I feel like I just want to get this through. Part of what I think these texts are doing is that they convince us to buy into it. The fantasy text that they created really allows us to buy into these systems and these hierarchies. And so part of what I want us to do is to resist that, constantly resist that. Heng's definition of race helps to ground the way I understand who is included and who is excluded within the borders of the Arthurian milieu. Defining race as a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences, end quote, in the construction of a hierarchy of peoples that are singled out for differential treatment, exposes that race is a social fabrication. And I'm using Heng here. Race is used by societies to establish and justify systems of power, privilege, disenfranchisement, and oppression. And racism becomes a system of advantages based on race that benefits the dominant culture. For modern critical race scholars of the Middle Ages, such as Geraldine Heng, Nicholas Lopez Jansen, Dorothy Kim, Sierra Lomuto, and Concord Whitaker, to name a few, have shown the importance of discussions of race in the study of the Middle Ages. Moreover, race and biopolitical ideologies also take on different functions in the Middle Ages, as Joseph Defossier and Cora Lumley show. Although I did not know it at the time, my interest in understanding biopolitics began with my study of the relationship between the concepts of law and sovereignty in Irish texts, because I am interested in understanding what the text normalized. An Arthurian text normalized the humanization and violence, localized European supremacy, and the expansion of the European borders. Because the sentiments that produce these texts are a type of reaction in order to deny the multicultural realities of medieval Europe, the text can only demonstrate multicultural and multilingual encounters through the language of chivalric aggression. Therefore, the text celebrates these encounters within the Arthurian quest. If these encounters place Arthur and his men at the center, they erase these same encounters along the borders of Europe in order to enact violence. In addition, this pan-European construction often incorporates woman as the body that justifies conquest and crusade, and only gives woman agency if the woman is or becomes Christian and her agency denounces and justifies violence. I would like to return to my Catalan example. The Catalan Arthurian text La Faula by Guillem de Torroella, a Catalan from Majorca, functions within a Majorcan, Catalonian, and European literary production, much like Tiran. For example, the poem territorializes Majorca and the Mediterranean through its complete erasure of the island's history, in which the Catalans took over the island and killed, enslaved, and displaced the Muslim population. The poem uses Ultraman, which is often translated as outrunner, to create an otherworld trip, and does so through the exoticization of the East, El Oriente, and its use of chivalry to naturalize medieval colonization. The poem must be understood through the Catalan literary production, through a Catalan literary production and the ways that their production helped construct a Catalan identity that presented the Catalans as a chivalric European enclave. And it does so by making Majorca a chivalric Catalonian and European space. Locally, La Faula is about inclusion in the Catalonian medieval empire. Globally, La Faula is about Catalan supremacy in a pan-European chivalric setting. I would like to tell you about the siege of Majorca, which was devastating to the native Muslim population, the majority of which was killed or enslaved by the Catalans. The colonization of Majorca functioned by defining and redefining chivalry in connection to Majorca. It was a long-term goal that began in 1113 with Pope Pascal II, who granted papal privileges to the siege of the Balearic Islands. It was not until 1229, however, that Jaume I was able to conquer Majorca. Jaume continued to conquer the rest of the Balearic Islands. In 1235, he conquered both Menorca and Ibiza. The conquest of Majorca helped define Jaume I. David Abulafia explains that for Jaume, a Catalan assault on Majorca would not just be a holy war, but also an opportunity to show his unruly vassals in Catalonia that he was a decisive and capable war leader, end quote. Regarding the Muslim population of the island, there were no settler agreements as in Valencia, for example. And what that means is that the settlers, the population, the Muslim population of the island was not given the chance to convert, right? So in Valencia, they basically forced people to convert, and that this was something that you could do, but that did not happen in Majorca. These events are intimately tied to the siege, with the result that the native populace was killed, enslaved, and displaced. Soto Company and mass foreigners remarked the success of colonization could only be guaranteed by the immigration of Christian settlers in sufficient quantities to replace all or part of the conquered Muslim society, end quote. The devastation brought to the Muslim community of Majorca because of the Catalan siege was so great that the Muslim population of Menorca agreed to recognize the overlordship of the King of Aragon, a decision that saved the Muslim population of Menorca from having the same fate as that of Majorca. The acquisition of the Balearic Islands was a violent endeavor that was described as a chivalric knightly one. And I just want to reiterate that Menorca recognized the overlordship of the Catalan kingdom because they did not want to go through what Majorca went through. The Balearic Islands have been crucial for the creation of a chivalric European cultural imagination. Jaume's account of the conquest of Majorca in the Libro del Fet describes the event as a chivalric adventure par excellence. And Bernades Clos and Ramon Montaner had familial connections to the island. And both Bernades Clos and Ramon Montaner are incredibly important Catalan writers whose work are canonical Catalan texts. Ramon Llull was born in Majorca in 1232 to newly settled Catalans. And Llull's Libro del Oro de Caballeria, which I mentioned in my introduction, was a medieval European bestseller and was translated into Occitan, French, English, Italian, and Spanish, and was considered the chivalric book par excellence of the later Middle Ages. Texts such as Llull's Blaquerna and Guillem de Torroellas La Faula, among others, turn these events into chivalric achievements, depict the conquest of the Catalan crown as a chivalric adventure. These manuscripts empty the islands of meaning by ignoring previous existing territorialities and then mapping new Catalan, Christian, and white territorialities and meanings. So by the time that Ramon Llull was growing up in Majorca, the remaining Muslim population was living under a harsh colonial environment. Llull was born in Majorca in 1232 or so just 3 years after the conquest of Majorca. In his youth in Colonia Majorca, about a third of the population was Muslim. By the time he was considered an adult, he boasted that there was an Arabic academy in Majorca in which Franciscan friars were trained in Arabic with the purpose of proselytizing. And for me, coming from Puerto Rico, I see this and it seems so similar to the processes that happen in the New World that I kind of find it shocking. I've seen several scholarly books argue that Llull grew up among a sizable Muslim population because a third of Majorca was Muslim. But what does this mean? Can we say that a third of the population is a sizable amount when just a few years earlier the whole of the island was Muslim? Whose positionality do we prioritize when we say a third is a sizable population? The colonization, reorganization, and redistribution of the island that emptied it of its previous territoriality was swift, decisive, violent, and continues to this day. We continue to enact violence on Majorca when we do not really grapple with the violence that chivalric ideologies played in the island. Llull grew up in Colonia Majorca, and his extensive work stood out for his theological ideologies of conversion. David Wax convincingly argues that Llull's Blaquerna, for example, and I quote, is a kind of chivalric novel remade in a spiritual missionary key. It substitutes spiritual and theological values for chivalric and courtly ones. Blaquerna's goal is to convert the entire world to Christianity, to lead by example, and to draw the infidel to Christianity through reason, debate, and logic. His crusade comes not only with a sword, but also with an argument, end quote. The text combines chivalry and Christian devotion, a pilgrimage, if you will, with the intent of converting the entire known population of the world Christian. Celia M. Lewis points out that crusade and pilgrimage are two sides of the same coin. Crusade becomes a literal conquest, while pilgrimage offers a symbolic return. The latter may be a means of individual spiritual conquest, internal rather than geographical or physical, its lasting value measured by the pilgrim's conscience, end quote. And this is what Arthuriana ultimately is, a chivalric pilgrimage that leads to differing forms of literary colonization. The connections between a literal return to conquest and a symbolic return to conquest become a way to erase the territoriality of Majorca. Llull's focus on conversion rewrites the conquest of Majorca, in which the option of conversion was not granted to most of the Muslim population. Blaquerna, in particular, erases the violent reality of the conquest and colonization of the island of Majorca. I find it striking that Blaquerna, the name of the titular knight in Llull's text, means to whiten, and Tiran lo Blanc, who I started with, means Tiran the White. What does it mean to whiten? To bleach away the history of Majorca and erase the violence of colonialism. Llull is remapping and rehistoricizing the story of Majorca and creating a chivalric archive to self-construct a Western identity. A litmus test for whiteness, la guerna, if you will. This is the context in which we must understand La Faula, which is an example of 14th century language politics in the Crown of Aragon, and uses Arthurian literature to claim Catalan chivalric superiority over that of France and England. In essence, making space for Catalonia within European politics. Guillem's poem is part of a larger Catalan corpus that was helping create and uphold the Catalan Empire and the superiority of Catalan chivalry, and turns to linguistic nationalism and linguistic imperialism to help construct and justify the medieval Catalan Empire. In the process, it also argues for Majorcan inclusion within that same system. Let's look at the poem more closely. La Faula begins with Guillem resting his sweaty horse by the shore in the Val de Soller, where he sees a papagayo on a boulder. Seeing the parrot surprises him because they supposedly come from ultramar. He tries to capture the papagayo from the rock, which turns out to be a fish-like whale that takes him east towards the enchanted island, La Infantia. The text says, as I entered the seas of Menorca, to my right the seas of Majorca, leaving behind the west, and I took to the east, just as the fish is taking me. End quote. And just so you know, this poem hasn't been translated to English at the moment, or Spanish. We have a translation, I think, in a new one that just came out in French and one in Italian. But in English, we still don't have one. But me and a colleague, Antonia Carcelén Estrada, we're currently working on this. So hopefully we'll have a translation for you all. Guillem arrives to an island in the evening where he meets a talking serpent. The serpent speaks to Guillem in French and explains to him that he is in the enchanted island where Morgan Le Fay and Arthur reside. Not only does the serpent speak in French, but the poem makes sure to tell us in Catalan that the serpent is speaking French. Guillem marvels at the natural beauty of the island. He tastes fruit of unimaginable flavor and washes his hands and face in beautiful and clear waters. In this first section, the poem constantly portrays animals as guides and as forms of transportation. These animals include the fish, the papagayo perched on top of the fish, the French-speaking serpent that tells him that he's in a hideout of Morgan and Arthur, and a horse that takes Guillem to Arthur. The horse is covered with a mantle that tells the love stories of Florise de Blanchefleur, Isolda Bronda de Tristany, and the figures of Paris and Helena, among others. These animals not only move Guillem and the plot forward in one way or another, they tie the poem to Catalonian literary production. Animal subjects make their appearance in other important Catalan texts, such as the swallow, una oreneta, that appears in King Jaume's El Libro del Fe de Rey Jaume, in which the king lets a bird nest on top of his tent until the bird and its offspring are ready to leave. A scene taken from the Arabic tradition during its appropriation of the Sanskrit and Greek canons. And actually, Ramon Llull also uses a lot of animals. And Blandín de Cornualla, which is a 14th century Catalan anonymous Arthurian text that I really don't work with. But the text also uses animals as guides and obstacles. And I don't think any other text is as creative as La Faula in the way that it uses animals, but really there is a lot of animals in Catalan text, which is really cool. Guillem finally meets Morgan, who tells him in French that Arthur is suffering from strange malady that is making him sad. She takes him inside to King Arthur, but instead of finding Arthur, he first sees stained glass windows decorated with the adventures of the Knights of the Round Table, including Tristany, Lancelot, Palomedes, Ivan, Perceval, and so on. When Guillem sees Arthur, he is lying ill on a bed dressed sumptuously. Guillem questions him and asks if he's truly Arthur by recounting the end of Mot Act 2. And Arthur explains that Morgan took him to the enchanted island where he is fed with the Holy Grail in order to keep his youthful appearance. Arthur shows Guillem why he is sad, mainly that chivalry is in peril. And Arthur wants Guillem to help bring back chivalry to its former glory. Guillem is asked to go back and to tell everyone what he saw on the island and what Arthur told him. The story moves us from Majorca east to the Enchanted Island. The choice to describe Guillem's movement in this way makes Guillem travel the whole of the Mediterranean and connect the other world and enchantment with eastward movement, pointing to El Oriente as a space that is imagined as marvelous and exotic. Moreover, the description of the island as a sumptuous paradise is a way to tie the island with conquest and wealth. Several scholars also believe that the text follows the tradition of connecting Avalon and Sicily, seen in texts such as Otia and Peralia and Florian and Floret. If so, the text uses the well-known motif of the standard trip to the other world in order to turn Sicily, a well-established island of the Crown of Aragon, into the Enchanted Island. Both Sicily and Majorca are Mediterranean islands that gave the Catalans and other European access to Africa. Sicily in particular was considered Pierre's greatest victory because the Catalans won the island against the French and because they managed to keep the island even after making a treaty to give it back to the French. Therefore, Guillem travels west to east, turning the Mediterranean into a Catalan Mediterranean. This movement places the Catalans front and center in European affairs by alluding that the Catalans are the protectors of the 14th century borders of Europe. La Faula is a chivalric pilgrimage to the east, ultramar, in which Majorca is now a Christian white enclave of Catalonia and Europe. So by the time that you go to La Faula, Majorca has been completely transformed into a white European space, even though that's not what the island is, even though at this moment you can still see that that's not. It literally, these texts are taking these spaces and changing their meaning. And so what I find interesting is that Guillem starts his adventure because he sees this papagayo, this parrot, and he says that it's, you know, he wanted to capture it because they come from ultramar. You know, we have texts La Conquista de Ultramar, which are really about the outrimmer. So it could be in crusading holdings in Armenia, Antioch, Tripoli, or in Jerusalem. But it could also have meant territories beyond the Eastern Mediterranean and maybe even the lands of Prester John. So Guillem is enticed literally by colonization, by medieval colonization. The otherworld island becomes a Catalan conquest in the protection of a Catalan Europe. The Catalans, including the Catalans from Majorca, are depicted as the future of chivalric conquest. By taking account of the history of Majorca, its past literary production, and paying close attention to the text, we can piece together the history of colonization hidden and normalized throughout the story. And it's done through notions of whiteness. These texts are constructing whiteness. Arthuriana from the global North Atlantic complicate the normative historical accounts that center the study of Arthuriana in Britain and France. Catalan Arthurian texts, the dissemination and production, exemplify why the global North Atlantic bridges a gap in the study of the North-South Atlantic littoral. Although medieval Arthurian literature shares ideologies of conquest motivated by ideologies of expansion, the motivation for the inclusion of these ideologies differs from culture to culture and even from text to text. Race is not fixed, and whiteness is slippery and porous. But what we see in Arthuriana is the normalization of violence and a litmus test for whiteness. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing now.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful paper. So much to think about. I wanted to sort of pause for a little minute to maybe allow folks in the audience to formulate questions. I don't yet see any submitted in the Q&A, so please take a moment to sort of think through, come up with some ideas that you might want to discuss. You know, as those sort of thoughts are generating, I thought perhaps as a sort of opening up a little bit of the project that you're working on, at least from maybe a methodological standpoint. This approach that you're building here, thinking through the Silko sort of quote of, thinking about scholarship as this sort of on the model of the web, on the model of sort of distributed emergent properties. There are ways in which the working method that you described there actually reminds me somewhat of descriptions I've heard of Gloria Anzaldua's working method. And I'm wondering whether there are lessons that you've learned there applying or exploring this methodology. How does it work for you? What works well? What are some approaches that you've built to help think about or rethink the way that we might pursue scholarship or pursue these sorts of networked studies that allow for a different emergent style of thinking, a sort of, allowing these texts to sort of breathe and open up and connect in the ways that you're finding their connection. They're connecting.
I feel that's a really big question. I think that Leslie Maimon Silko was the beginning because it allowed me to think of Arthurian text differently than how I came to them, right? Because when we start thinking about Arthurian texts and how we are taught, right, about these texts, it really does begin with the French, English, and German traditions, right? And also, I came from a comparative literature background, so also that's how comparative literature works. So there was this really big tradition that I'm supposed to be working off, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to push against it, and honestly, I wanted to push against it because I also had really great colleagues that made me think about it. Why are we doing, why an original text? Why these ideas? And so Leslie really helped me think of these texts differently and keep in mind what I was seeing. So it allowed me to approach the reading of these texts differently, but it also allowed me to approach these texts in a way that made sense to me, because one of the things that she says where I got this quote from Leslie Maimon Silko is that these type of movement is also a movement that she sees in Caribbean models and other models. And I was like, yes, this is the movement that makes sense to me. So it gave me a way to also allow myself to do the work that came naturally to me and make it acceptable. And when I read Leslie Maimon Silko, she was already an amazing scholar, right? It's like also Borderlands, who also is a text that just, I think that Borderlands is in the habichuelas. We call, in Puerto Rico, we always eat rice and beans. So my mom says, is in the beans. It's just there. You just eat it every day. So Borderlands is just so formative for me that it's just ingrained in some ways. So that those kinds of materials just allowed me to be able to do the kinds of things that I already was doing into how I was looking at these materials.
Can I actually ask a question? That's all right. Thank you so much for your paper, which was really, inspired so many thoughts and ideas and questions for me. But one thing that I noticed that, and maybe this feeds a little bit off of the question, the issue you were just addressing with Andrew, is islands. The way that islands seem to function in so much of what you're doing, and also the specific examples that you were talking about. So when comparing the two maps that you presented, the one that had been generated by the Spanish exhibition, which had the big circles in Champagne and England.
I'll share it again.
Yeah. I was noticing that map compared to the one which you had marked up, showing your critique or your modified view, right? Is that it seems to point to a lot more islands, and And then you also drew the comparison between the Majorca, the history of Majorca and the Caribbean experiences of conquest, and also the way the text itself, La Faula, it goes from one island to another island, right? That although they are heading for Ultramar, which might be Outremer or whatever, but it's actually an island that they arrive at. So is there something about a shift in the later medieval, the 14th century, the literature, the Arthurian literatures, and the kind of process you're talking about, that in which islands are somehow part of that churn?
Sorry, my lights went out and I'm trying to get them, but I can't. So I'm gonna be in the dark. I apologize. I think that I probably am drawn to islands, so that's might just be me, and that's part of why these are texts that I constantly come back to. But there are other ways that you can see that this is actually much more complicated. So, for example, I didn't even mention it here, but so we have documents from the north of Spain with Arthurian names all over the north of Spain. And so one of the works I've done is I've mapped where we found those names, the places, and I show how connected they are to the Camino de Compostela, to all the different caminos. So the first name that we have, the first document that we have that has an Arthurian name predates the Historia Regum Britannica. And the Catedral de Santiago de Compostela has an image that there's arguments about it, but basically most people think it's Tristan that predates the extant French romances that we have available. So when I show that, part of what I want to show is these texts have been traveling orally for a very long time, as long as the Historia Regum Britannica. For some reason, these stories are everywhere. So another colleague of mine, Kathleen Kennedy, pointed out to me that if you actually put the spice routes, like the water routes, next to my map, they really correlate with each other. So the movement that I am seeing is a movement that is already happening. So part of what I want to show is that the stories are moving with the people, right? And they're moving with the people, not just by land, but also by sea. So when you have a kingdom like the Catalan kingdom who moves so much by sea, they describe sea movement as chivalric movement, right? That we don't see it so much because we kind of always, I think, we imagine the horse and the going on the horse, right? So so for me, what I'm interested in is chivalry as a concept that's tied then to this toxicity within Arthuriana, and trying to want to create these sort of the expansion. And I think it was happening in many ways in different areas, right? But the texts that I work with, because they are the peripheries, are also texts that are about waterways and much more. So, but yeah, I think that I have no doubts that I am drawn to literature that is island generated, from like Old Irish to Old Norse to Catalan. Like in La Faula is, I would say, I love that text so much. It's so much going on in that text. It's just it makes me jump of joy when I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So I think you're right. The islands are my jam. Yeah.
Thank you.
Building off of the map that you currently have on display, we have a question from a graduate student. It seems actually 2 questions from a graduate student, which would be great. So I'm going to populate those out and read them through. So the question starts thinking about the map and says, the map at the beginning of your talk did a great job of showing the spread of Arthuriana geographically, but I was wondering if you could fill out the picture more chronologically. Based on manuscript or other evidence, when does Arthuriana become really popular in Iberia? And are there reasons for that politically and socially? For instance, did Catherine of Lancaster promote it during her regency in Castile? Why does it become popular in the mid-14th century with La Faula, a century after the initial Reconquista?
So part of the problem we have with Spain, like I said, there, we have the names, right? We know that Arthurian literature was popular very early on. But part of the problem is we're just also missing a lot of manuscripts, and we don't know exactly why. I'm gonna see. I don't. So for example, we have chancery registers of Catalonia. They have tons and tons of really, and I think we know that they had over 30 Arthurian books, and I think we have maybe like 5 versions available. So what we do know is that there's so much we don't have that we don't have available. So there's a little bit of that. I think that there's a shift in thinking after the 13th century that also you see in how these texts are playing out. So all these texts are later texts, right? 13th, 14th century texts, and most of the texts I work with are 13th and 14th century. But I think what it's doing, I think that you can already start to see this as far as the Historia, right? Geraldine Heng does a really great job of showing how the Historia is already imagining the saving of the aristocratic maiden, right, as an Arthurian system, and then how this gets replayed and redone in other Arthurian texts is really interesting. So yeah, I think that the texts I work with really are from the 13th and 14th century and even later than that. But then we also know that there's so much that we don't have. So and so part of what I'm trying to do in some ways is to decenter the timeline, to look at them as a system. So what happens when we look at Arthurian texts as a system that's working together, even if these texts are from different time periods? Because the interesting thing is some of these texts are linguistically from one time period, rewritten, the manuscript is from a different time period, and we don't, so we also have to work with that, right, in medieval studies. So I try very hard to actually try to decenter the timeline of these texts and think about it as a genre more than as a chronological material. And that also comes from my perspective that is important to resist periodization and the idea that having a chronological history somehow can tell us more. I want to resist that in how I work with these texts as well, although I do a lot of historical work.
And then a second question from graduate students. So this question reads, the idea of a common whiteness or chivalric ideology is complicated not only by the past conquered Islamic cultures of the Crown of Aragon, but also the fact that the Catalan Empire was rarely united. Majorca had to be reconquered in the 14th century, Sardinia always revolted, and even the native Sicilians didn't always like the Catalan king. So is Arthurian fantasy both a justification and a sort of aspirational dream?
Yes, it of course. So I think that's what fantasy I think is doing at this time is imagining the contours, right? So another two very different texts. The Historia has a scene, one of the Arthurian scenes with the giant, right? And in that scene, the giant is from Hispania. The same rewriting of that scene in the 13th century Norwegian version, the giants are now from Africa. The difference in the 100 years is that Spain is no longer Al-Andalus, it's now mostly a Christian space. So you can see that the text, the geography changes and the text change, right? And what's happening in 14th century Spain? Well, actually, the Catalan and the Castilian crowns are partitioning Africa. We have documents that say they were thinking of how they were going to take over Africa. So here you have a Scandinavian text imagining African giants at the same time that Spanish kings are thinking about how they're going to divide north of Africa between themselves because it's part of the Visigoth kingdom and theirs. So yes, Arthurian literature is creating a fantasy that is about colonization. And for example, Sierra Lomuto, she's done some excellent, amazing work looking at, I think it's how Mandeville is also creating fantasies to doing a similar, or in some ways different version of this, right? The fantasy is giving that aspect. For me, the hopeful thing about this is if fantasy could create these borders, then also fantasy can be a way to dismantle them, right? So those are the ways that I try to make myself feel better.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nahir, for those answers, and thank you, Michael, for your questions. We have another graduate student with a question that she'd like to ask from Christian Rancanillo. Could you talk just a little further about the difficulties in settling on a terminology for your geographic area of study, specifically Global North Atlantic, which has a wide reach, versus Latin Christian West, a term with a much more narrow and exclusive perspective? Are there other ways of describing this area that you've considered?
Oh, I've tried several ways. I tried to say peripheral text. Pan-European. I've tried different terminologies of how I wanted to do this. When I started this, I would often say the Mediterranean of the North. So there are some ways, the Atlantic littoral was another way that I talked about it. I think that I ended up thinking of the global North Atlantic because I looked at the map and I realized that the North Atlantic basically just goes all the way up from Iceland to the north of Africa, which is what I was talking about. And it was kind of upsetting to me that we say North Atlantic and we only mean the very top of the North Atlantic. And so that was one thing that kind of got me to that. And another, I'll be honest, I was talking to in a conference, I met Geraldine Heng for the first time. And of course, I'm here meeting the one of the most important people for my work who changed, her Empire of Magic changed how I understood. Like, it was like, this is what I want to do. She already did it. Now, but she did, so I can do it outside because she did it here. And I was explaining all these connections and why it's okay that I'm doing all these different spaces, even if they don't work. And she's like, oh, so like you do like the global North Atlantic. And she just told me, and I was like, yes, that's what I do. And so she absolutely helped me create this idea, but I think it works for me because what it was really exciting for me when she said it, and it was like, when someone says, oh, you do this, and you didn't know you did that until they say it, and then you're like, yes, that is exactly what I do. And what I like about it is, yes, it's open. I think I don't want to limit how we think about these things. The more open, the better. But the reality is that Arthurian literature is everywhere. There is, I make the argument that there's a Puerto Rican text that has an Arthurian character in it and is doing something very different. And there's Arthurian characters all over now. And people are doing very different things with these characters. Can we save Arthur as a character? I'm not so sure that we can, but it is true that it's that it is a genre that it really is far-reaching. And that's part of why I was so interested. I first read of Arthur because my grandfather and my father told me stories about Lancelot and Arthur. And so yeah, I think that part of what I wanted to understand is why are these texts so keep coming back? And I think it's because they show an anxiety about positionality and an anxiety about whiteness. And I think ultimately that's where they're coming from.
That speaks so brilliantly to the post-medieval resurgences of Arthuriana in all of these moments of cultural crisis and cultural pressure and transformation, right? Like it maintains that ability and has that continuing power for various post-medieval cultural spaces. Uh, Fantastic. We have a question from Tom O'Donnell from the English department, who says, thanks for a fantastic talk. I'm so looking forward to your monograph and teaching your translation of La Faula someday. The arguments posed in the talk today were very compelling. Could you say more about the connections between medieval whiteness, which describes the product of this chivalric expansionism, and the later history of whiteness in the United States and elsewhere? Thank you.
I don't know if I can do that. But I think for me, what's important is the way that I understand whiteness, and it's about dehumanization, right? And about exclusion. And so, and it's about how systems that use whiteness to dehumanize and exclude. And so that's how I understand whiteness, right? It has zero to do, it's an ideological system, right? And so we can uphold whiteness whether we're white or not, just like we can try to resist it as well. So so that's how I read whiteness. Whiteness wants to say that whiteness is the norm, and this is how everybody should be, and everything other than that is wrong or not normal somehow. And when we allow it to run rampage, then we create dehumanization. And when we do that, then the violence that we see when we create that dehumanization is terrible, right? And this is it's so much more complicated, right? But this is how the way that I can define whiteness for myself that makes sense to me for this text that I'm looking at, but also for the ways that my lived experience in many ways. How do people, like, how come that, for me, how come that we can, you see people just, I can't even articulate it right now, but just at moments you see people react in a way that you say, you clearly don't see me as a person, or you wouldn't react that way, or why do you think that it's okay to act that way when you clearly would not act that way or have not acted that way to somebody else? And I don't have answers, but what I see now, especially with police brutality right now, is an inability to see the people that you are talking to as human, and not that you don't know that they're human, but you still don't see them as you see them as they're flawed. You don't give them the benefit of the doubt. I think that's a way to say it. The loss of capacity to give people the benefit of the doubt and a humanity, so that when you look at them, you don't see their flaws, you see a person that is complicated, right? This flattening of people. Who do we flatten? Who do we say gets to have really complicated life stories, and who gets to just be a caricature? These kinds of things. That's what I see whiteness doing, is wanting to sell this idea that whiteness is the only thing that can have all these things. And so that's the way that is, I think, the way that I define it that works for me. But I understand all these terms as not fixed, and that their meanings changes and they're complicated. And just like I understand, Wittgenstein and language as not having one meaning but multiple meanings. There are many ways that we can do it. But this is the way that I have found these texts are working. They're testing it out. I think that they're literally testing out whiteness, just like a lot of these texts are testing other things and seeing what works and what doesn't. I feel like they were testing out colonization. They were testing out how to get all these things going in the most efficient way possible. And it was beginning in the Middle Ages. And yeah, it's kind of shocking to me how good we got at it, and kind of depressing.
I mean, it's one of the things where when, I think there's been some really strong work done on tracing the ways that sort of English discourse around the Irish ends up becoming directly adapted to become the discourse that ends up getting used by English colonialists towards Native Americans when the colonies are established in the New World, right?
Oh yeah, and there's lots of work on whiteness and like marked whiteness and unmarked whiteness being done by a lot of scholars. I'm blanking out on the names. There's a lot of really good work being done on all these things. Like I didn't invent any of this, right? Like, just so everybody knows.
It makes me think about what you were saying during your talk about always asking with your Arthurian texts, what do those texts normalize, right? And I was curious whether in your thinking about that question across such a wide breadth of texts, across such a number of languages and sort of temporal moments, whether there are ways in which you think, whether ways that you see the normalization of whiteness occurring in those texts following any trends over time? Do you see there being any shifts in the ways that whiteness operates in those texts, or is it too distributed and too localized to sort of talk about larger patterns, right? I mean, part of what you're talking about is the way that the sort of formations of race are local, are malleable, are shifting, are constantly in movement. And so I'm wondering whether there's sort of utility in thinking about sort of trends or patterns at a larger scale, or whether it's always going to be a kind of local investigation.
I just don't know how to you can. I already feel that I am not doing justice to what these texts are doing, because I'm trying to say how they're working as a system. Like that when you do that, you're going to create these streamlined where you're gonna leave text out. So I feel like I'm already trying so hard and failing and not doing that it becomes really hard of how do you talk about these broad strokes without then doing a disservice to other texts. But I think for the way that has become really important to me is to just think of what each text is doing and how they're then been doing these things. How are they, what kinds of movement are they showing, textually, and like the translation of the text, like the manuscript, what do we know about it? The movement that the text shows in textually, the movement of the text as what do we know about the origins of, was it a translation? What don't we know about it? And then thinking about what the texts say, and in trying to take each text, sort of ask the same questions of each text, but still try to see if each text is doing something. And then when there are moments of comparisons, right, like the giants, then instead of saying, well, what they're doing the same, I actually want to say what is different, and what it is that's different. What does it say about that particular version? So I try, for me, that's the best way to manage my corpus, because it is a really large and rich corpus.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting model for imagining how we build scholarship that bridges across so many different regions and still manages to sort of find something sort of, synthetic to say about them without falling into the trap of trying to synthesize them into a unified thing, right? That's really, really hard to do, but it's such impressive work. I think those are all the questions that we have. So unless anybody has a last question that they'd like to get in, I think we'll wrap up today's event. Please join me in offering Nahir one final round of applause. This has just been such a pleasure to have you as part of our community over the course of the day. We really appreciate all of the energy and effort that you've put into our work together. And we're just so glad that we could bring you. And hope you'll come back at some point.
Yes. Thank you so much. I can say, I mean, our classrooms, our seminars, our office hours, our what amounts for a casual conversation on Zoom are going to be brimming with the ideas that you shared with us today. So, and for a long time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a wonderful day. Thank you.